All right. All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Happy Veterans Day to those or any of you who may have served or are actively serving. Also, I've recently learned it's World Usability Day, which is celebrated on the second Thursday of every November, which is targeted to raise standards so that technology works to harness the human potential. So I thought that was a nice coincidence for today and based on our guest speaker. On behalf of the Women at the Mart, thank you so much for joining our 5th installment of the Small Bites series titled Leveraging Storytelling in Our Careers with our special guest, Heather Dowdy, Netflix's Director of Accessibility and a former Motorolan, where I was lucky enough to meet this extraordinary woman several years ago. My name is Kailey Meyer, and I'm co-founder of Women at the Mart, and I'm currently the chief of staff of product here at Motorola, a Lenovo company located in Chicago. Before we get started and appropriately introduce our guest speaker, one quick note, if you are using the desktop app of Teams, being conscious of accessibility, there is an option under the 3 dots for live captions, if that would help you. If you're on the browser, unfortunately, it's a limitation, part of the need to get accessibility improved in the future years, but please go ahead and do so. In case this is your first event with us, Women at the Mart is a grassroots multi-company initiative that we created back in 2017. And it's aimed to share resources to create programming that develops, retains, and motivates female talent among companies, especially represented in the iconic Merchandise Mart office here in Chicago, Illinois. This is our 16th event as a group, and we just celebrated 4 years in July. And our board is currently comprised of Motorola Mobility, a Lenovo company, which I represent, Conagra Brands, Beam Suntory, Allscripts, and the Mart, a Vornado company. Many of our board members are active in their internal company women's groups. For instance, I'm also a board chair of our Lenovo's Women in Lenovo Leadership, where I integrate our WAM programming. And all board members are asked to contribute to at least one event a year, either hosting or providing resources. So if you're interested in joining our board, you are welcome to reach out to us at womenatthemart@gmail.com, listed on the bottom here. And I'll make sure to put that in the chat at some point as well. As far as our Small Bite series, we've been doing this and featuring, this is our 5th one. We've been featuring leaders from our member companies or associates in casual conversations. So today's format is going to be a casual conversation between me and Heather, but you're more than welcome to submit your questions in the chat or raise your hand. We'll look for ways to incorporate your questions or your voice. So with all that said, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and focus on introducing Heather. So Heather, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's been so good to reconnect with you in preparation for this event and again here today.
Thanks, Kailey. Thank you all for having me, Women at the Mart. This is so special. I love full circle moments. Kailey and I worked on Women at Moto back when I was working at Motorola, and I'm so fond of working at the Mart, remembering taking the train and meeting all of so many different people from different companies. I would love to just introduce myself with a visual description. I am Heather Dowdy. I am a brown-skinned African-American woman wearing a bright blue dress that is short sleeve with gold jewelry. I have a medium wavy curly hair today, as well as purple lipstick and some orange earrings and a ring. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Heather. And I think, that's quite unique in the introduction that you've done. And I think, having your background in this area, I've learned something every day as far as it's not something you hear every day in a conversation. So I think we could all take note that it's appreciated by many. So now keeping with our theme today, leveraging storytelling in our careers, I think it's only appropriate that we start off by getting to know a little bit about your story. Seeing that you've admittedly kept it private, a little bit when you were here at Motorola early in your career. So, what's exactly your story and what have you learned, what exactly is the story that you've learned to leverage over your career? Like, who is Heather Dowdy?
Yeah, what a great question. And maybe back in the day that would have intimidated me a little bit because it's a big question to ask anyone. But I'm so glad to have done the work, and I'm able to articulate it based on the journey I've taken today. So, I'm Heather Dowdy. I come to my work as a disability rights advocate, both personally and professionally. I am a CODA, which is Child of Deaf Adults. I grew up on the south side of Chicago with two deaf and hard of hearing parents. And so I pretty much lived at the intersection of race and socioeconomic status and gender and disability. And growing up on the south side of Chicago taught me a lot living at that intersection, but particularly living in our home, I witnessed the power of technology. We grew up with all of these different gadgets that help my parents and I communicate with others outside of our home. There's a story that I have on the internet that talks about a doorbell that was connected to a lamp in our living room. So whenever someone would ring the doorbell, this lamp would flash to let my parents know visually that someone was at the door. Then I remember this big bulky teletypewriter that my parents used to talk to someone who was a relay operator that would connect them to someone who was hearing. And you could only type one line at a time. Imagine the way that we talk today and interrupting ourselves. It was very awkward, and quite honestly, it wasn't representative of the deaf community, the signing community that I grew up in. I learned sign language at 6 months old. My first word was pizza. So if you want to teach your kids sign language associated with food, they'll remember it. But sign language is vibrant. I mean, even facial expressions are the equivalent of grammar in English. There are so much more than just movements and gestures. And there are so many layers to that. So to fast forward to being able to work at Motorola and being a part of ushering in more accessible mobile technology for the disability community was a dream come true, right? Like, now we can text, which was a game changer for my family and other people in the disability community. And then fast forwarding today, where we're all using video phone, but quite honestly, was a really huge game changer because I can interact with other deaf and signing individuals in our natural language. We can see each other instead of that big bulky teletypewriter. So at my core, I love technology. I've witnessed the power of it, but I also personally am passionate about connecting the dots between race, disability, technology, and faith. And for me, all of that is multi-layered, but I keep at the forefront my core values, and they guide me along what opportunities to take and what work I want to be part of. And my core values are faith, my family, and freedom. So that's who I am at my core.
Wow. Well, thank you for sharing that. I remember the first time I read your story, it was like a Microsoft blog that was published a few years back. And I just remember thinking, how did I not know this? I gained a whole nother appreciation for everything that you do and what you were doing here at Motorola in the past and what you're doing going forward, knowing that it was more than a career path, just a choice, but something that had personal connection to you. And I thought that was amazing. So give me some insight on that. Why did you originally feel that you needed to keep your story private or less exposed? Was it intentional or was it something that just didn't come up?
That's a really good question. And you're actually the first person that asked me that, probably because we worked together and I didn't share much of my story when we worked together. For me, fresh out of college, I worked at Motorola. And so, like a lot of fresh new engineers, we want to fit in, especially when you're a Black woman engineer. And for me, it was okay, I'm really passionate about the work that I do, but I just want to I don't want to stand out too much. I want to fit in. So that was one thing. But the other part too was that it really didn't have a welcoming environment, so to speak. I remember a lot of my journey at Motorola being with managers, and in particular, there were two white male managers that would sit in meetings and they would go through like org charts and comment on people's race with me sitting in the room. And so that didn't feel like I could be all of me, or nor did I really feel that I had a voice at that time to really go, this really isn't inclusive. Why are you doing this? And so it has been a journey to go, well, I'm really passionate about this and I want people to know that I'm passionate about it, but it's more than that. It really is part of my core values. And so I began really starting to share my story little by little as to how I came to this work, and it's part of my career journey. And then it really took off from there.
That's great to hear. I mean, obviously not, you don't want to hear that, in the environment of workplace. I think it's, getting better over the years, but, there's definitely always instances of that. So you mentioned your core values were kind of a reason for coming, more open with that. So what was it that really inspired you to kind of go more public with it? Like, was this Microsoft thing the biggest thing you publicly did, to expose yourself? Or, how did you initially go about, starting to tell your story?
Yeah, so I worked at Motorola for 10 years, and in specifically just developing accessible technology in mobile. And I transitioned to Microsoft in Redmond, Washington, where I spent about 5 years and focused on accessible technology in web and AI. And upon that transition of getting to Microsoft, there was a woman, she was a Black woman, who began asking me, like, how did you get here? And like, how did you come across this work, right? Because for some people, this seems like a new field, or you become interested in, well, do you have a disability? Like, how are you in this work? And so I began to share with her my story of really how it all started, being 6 months old and learning American Sign Language, and how that really propelled me into the career that I chose in electrical engineering. And she was like, you got to tell your story. And I'm an introvert, so I'm like, actually I don't. I don't have to tell it. I'm totally fine with this. But she really supported me in telling it. And what's interesting? It was the opposition that I got to releasing that story that made me go, oh, I should really tell my story, because who would oppose telling your personal story, right? But transparently, it really wasn't until more recently, unfortunately, last year, with our country's racial reckoning and the murders of George Floyd, that even the disability community was open to talking about race. Before then, it was seen as divisive. It was really hard to move the focus away from just disability to all of the many dimensions that we are. And so receiving that pushback was like, no, I'm going to tell my story, and I'm going to make sure that I tell it well. And I can't even tell you the response that I got after I told my story. It really solidified for me why it's so important for us to share our story. I got emails, and I still get emails to this day, and messages from other people, from people with disabilities, specifically the audience that I serve, saying, thank you for being visible. Thank you for telling your story. It encouraged me to tell more of my own. And the reason why that's important is because in some way, all of us, touch disability. Like 70% of disabilities are invisible. So you could be working with a person living with a disability today and don't even know it. And then many others of us are caregivers of people living with disabilities. Disability is a natural part of life. We tell people all the time, it's the one community that you can join at any time in your life. And so it is definitely just part of the condition of life. And so by being visible, by speaking to the many dimensions of it, it just allows other people to dig in and share their own story. And that's what fuels me to keep going.
Wow, that's great. I can't believe you got some pushback. I almost want to push you and say, tell me a little bit more about this
Yeah.
pushback because I can't, it's so unbelievable. But, I appreciate you being so open with that. And, you noted that obviously there was a natural response, to you telling your story and definitely from the community itself. But, you also mentioned to me, and part of what the theme of the story is, how you leveraged it for your career. So, other than the obvious awareness within your role of that you had this connection, with, accessibility and making things technology more accessible. What other things, like how did it help you in your career, that other people might relate to here on this call?
What telling my story did for me was force me to sit with it, force me to sit with the uncomfortable parts and the great parts. Depending on how you're predispositioned, sometimes you can focus a lot on the negative parts, right? I happen to be one of those people and I'm recovering.
You're not alone.
And yeah, but when I really sat with it to get clear for me where I came from, exactly what propels me and what makes me tick and what I like and what I don't like, I was able to carry that clarity into the work that I wanted to do next. And so that really allowed me to craft opportunities that really fit with my core values and what I was driving for. So, for instance, as I mentioned, I moved from mobile to web to AI technology, particularly focused on accessibility. And AI was something that it was like, yeah, I want to talk about the future of accessibility. You start thinking forward because I was able to personally witness how far, but how slow progress had been in the disability community. When we talk about things like employment, before COVID and the pandemic, the unemployment rate for people with disabilities in the US was 50 to 80%. It has been stagnant for 30 years. So when you think about that, and when I thought about my own story, if you ever look it up on the internet, I talk a lot about my dad working at the post office for 40 years, which is amazing. I have to recognize that being part of my story and some privilege in that. But at the same time, 40 years, you and I get to choose different roles today. Why aren't we affording those same type of opportunities to people living with disabilities? And so I say all that to say that then illuminated, oh, that's a problem spot. And I'm passionate about fixing it. And so that clarity just allows us to speak to the things that we want to see happen, the legacy that we want to have, and the work that we want to work on. And quite honestly, it makes it easier to say yes to the right opportunities that align and to say no because you're making space for the thing that you know that you're really going to go after with passion.
Wow. No, I think it's a great point. And I think, a lot of people on this call might be thinking, well, maybe I don't have that story. Like I don't have something maybe that obvious to them on why they're doing what they're doing or what they want to do. Do you have any advice there? Because I think, most people, a lot of people probably are questioning that right now.
That's so important. And I still struggle with that, right? Sometimes I struggle with being seen as, oh, she has this quote unquote special story. And it is the affirmation and the recognition that people get to see themselves in my story that motivates me to keep telling. So people have come up to me that didn't really, know about disability before and go, oh, but I loved how the story talked about you and your dad as a relationship. And so that translates. And so we are hardwired for story. Let's just say that. I truly believe that everybody has a story. This life is not without its ups and downs and transitions. And so everybody has a story. The harder part is being able to sit with it and face it. And I'm a lot stronger because I know the ins and outs of my story. There's a story, there's a version that's published on the internet, right? But there's also a flip side to personally how difficult it was for me at times being a coda and having to find my way, or even being a female in engineering. And so because I have done that work, healing is so important to me. I'm able to show up in spaces authentically with my story. And so I just really encourage everyone to take the time to self-reflect, to work through the parts of the story, because it really does connect us. There are people in my network that, because I have told my story, this year, Google had a commercial with a coda. He and his child were communicating with his deaf parents through video chat. And so many people were blowing me up like, oh my goodness, I know what that person is. That person's a coda because I know your story. Or recently on Apple TV, they released a movie called Coda. I highly recommend that folks look at it. And people are like, "Are you gonna watch it?" Like, this gave me so much insight. So it's those things that help us remember each other is through story. Like, even when you and I were working together, I remembered your passion for curling. So when we reconnected, I'm like, "Hey, how's that going?" We just remember those parts about each other. And so you don't necessarily have to tell all of your story, but I am certain that there is a part of your story that you want to work through for you so that you can show up as fully yourself, and so that you can begin to align with the things and the work that you want to be doing.
Yeah, no, and I think that's so important. I think even just reflecting briefly on my own, just there's the little things when you start to think about what is it that you want. So, when I started thinking like, oh, what would I want to do next in my career? It's like product is always the central point, right? So I know like I don't want to be in web, or I don't want to be in like banking or something like that. I want to be in product, something tangible. And so even if you just find those little things that are important to you, it could really help set your direction, and where you want to go. And I think that's probably, what a lot of people on this call might relate to too, is just knowing that, without that core story or without that base, there could be a lot of times where we say yes to things, that we might not, maybe shouldn't have said yes to. Like it's okay sometimes to say no, and if it doesn't align with what your core values, as you put it, are, or your story. So maybe like, is there any advice you would give to people based on your experience since identifying your story, where you've said yes or no to things based on that core values and knowing what you want, that you can give advice to for people?
Well, it was actually my story that attracted Netflix to me, and other employers as well, putting my story out on the web. I recently transitioned from Microsoft to Netflix all of about 3 months ago. And so it was so refreshing to be in the midst of interviewing, and even now meeting new colleagues that go, oh, I read your bio online, I read your story, I feel like I know who you are. And that really, for me, has been refreshing and comforting. So, do they know every single thing? No, but it's a great place to start, right? And so I had a conversation this week where I was like, oh, I'm so glad you read my story. Let me tell you what you don't know about me. And it just kind of continues to go on in terms of how I want to relate to people and how I want to show up. But particularly for me, because I had been visible with telling my story and also amplifying other folks' story. I want to say that as well. It takes some time to really sit with our stories and to bring out those nuggets and really allow it to direct us where we want to go. And in the meantime, because we're hardwired for story, that doesn't mean that you can't amplify someone else's story. That doesn't mean that we can't figure out what it is that we like about other people's story and allow it to remind us about our own story. That's so important. But because I had been visible and sharing my story, when Netflix approached, compared to some of the other companies, I was like, oh, you all do storytelling.
Mhm.
Storytelling is really what I like to do right now. Storytelling is really important to me because, of my core values, and because Netflix represents that freedom within storytelling. For me, I was able to ascertain that this would be a good fit for me compared to some of the other opportunities that I was presented with.
Oh, that's all great. Um, I do want to take a minute to kind of pivot a little bit to specifically to accessibility, just because I think, obviously it's an area that people are probably curious about joining. And nearly all companies in some way, provide products, solutions, services, something that needs to think about the consumers and all consumers. So what would you say are some of the most common misconceptions or things that major corporations overlook when it comes to being accessible?
There's a lot there. But just to start, accessibility at its core is the design and development of services and products that empower people of all abilities. And I tend to start with the definition of disability because how we view people, whether it's how we view disability or race or gender, really impacts our interaction with folks as well. And so the World Health Organization defines disability as a mismatch between the person and the environment. So it doesn't mean that the person can't do something. The environment wasn't set up for them to do it according to their ability. And when we think about that, whole lot of environments that we could modify, that we could accommodate people to flexibly suit all needs. And so that's important whether you are in an HR function or you are developing product like we are. There is a place for everyone, whether it's basic awareness 101 on what disability is. And Netflix has a part of that in the stories that we tell, where you're able to see more characters online and in movies that have disabilities. So whether that's awareness or it also is the person who can just send an accessible email. If you're using certain products like Microsoft products, there's an accessibility checker in the menus that you can use to check before you send out an email to check that it's accessible. Okay, you feel like, yeah, that sounds good. How about I hit you with social media? During the pandemic, we all had to go online to find information. But did you know that only 3% of websites are accessible to people with disabilities? People who use screen readers, for instance, and other technology. That means 97% people of websites are not accessible. 97%. When we post on social media, we can describe the images that we post so that they are accessible to people with disabilities who also use social media platforms. There's so much that we can do, but the key that I'm driving here, the point is that there's something for all of us to do. And so as companies, we really need to think about how we are training and giving that message from up top that we want to make our products and services and our culture, quite frankly, disability inclusive. And that is so important, rather than perhaps in the past, folks have thought like, oh, we'll just have an accessibility team do all this work for us. That is not scalable. That is not progress. And quite honestly, we're missing out on a lot of innovation when we all aren't taking advantage of learning. And as we say in this industry, when you solve for one, you get to extend it for many. How many of you have benefited from closed captions at the gym? There's so much more that we can do when we all lean in.
Oh, I think that's that's a great point. I think I remember in our past conversations, you noted a point to me where you just said sometimes the frustrations in the industry, in engineering in particular, where everyone just expects people to know how to use the products or technology. Like even not even getting to the level of accessibility, but even just basic usages and stuff, and really how we can do so much more to look at things a little differently, and not being the experts of the one who put something together and trying to think about the consumers, especially those that need extra needs. I think it's unbelievable on sometimes. So how have you approached some situations in your work field? So if you come across an engineer or something that just says like, this is how it should work, and doesn't really think any further about it, you know,
Yeah,
how do you respond to such things, knowing what you know?
all the time. That's why I have a position, right? No matter what I'm going to do, I like to tell people education and raising awareness are going to be part of the job. For me, I've been really fortunate, because I am an engineer, to also have empathy for other folks building products and other folks that are just starting on their journey, whether that's their disability awareness journey or whether that's their anti-racism journey, whatever it is. The point is, have you started the journey and are you open to walking with someone along that journey? That's first and foremost. And for me, in terms of really bringing people along, once you sort of assessed where they are currently, I like to make it easy for them to implement. And I also like to make it relatable. And so in my work, I tend to do a lot of, okay, well, what will happen if we don't make this accessible? This user will not be able to use this at all. This is not necessarily okay, maybe they might not have a great experience. There are cases where we are shutting out whole groups of people from reading emails, from engaging with us on social media, from using our products completely, like full stop. Full stop. And then once we remediate that, like, how can we take it further? And eventually, how can we actually delight the group of people with disabilities? And so once we get to that point, it becomes a challenge. And I love challenging people, right, to go further with what we can do and how we can innovate. And so those are some things that I think about in approaching and helping people along their accessibility journey.
Thanks for sharing that. And I think, me just reflecting on my own, involvement in my industry and product, I'm sure that there's so much more I can personally do, I think, just to try to think about that on a regular basis. I think we all get caught up in the requirements and things that are, mandated for us to do. But I think a lot of times we need to do more to think about others, like you mentioned, and try to I think you hit it on the point saying that it's don't just depend on the team that has the accessibility tag to go and find the solutions. We really, if we do that, we're always behind the curve, right? You're always implementing and then getting feedback. And I think we need to think more forward looking. So thanks for
And if
sharing
I
that.
could add, this week was an example of, again, where storytelling is so powerful. If folks follow me on LinkedIn, I shared a story this week of a disability rights advocate in Gracia Figueroa who passed away a couple weeks ago. And perhaps you encountered or saw her story in the news this summer, where she was flying and traveling to DC, and she was traveling back to home, and the airlines crumpled or damaged her customized wheelchair. This wheelchair cost $30,000. So remember, I talked about the high unemployment rate earlier on, right, for the disability community. Let's not even get into how expensive it can be to have the equipment and the accommodations that you need. That's a whole nother section, whole nother day. But they damaged her wheelchair, and in the process of trying to, remediate the situation, she was sitting in a broken wheelchair for 5 hours, going back and forth with them. After the incident, the airlines did not want to apologize. There was a big public outcry. Well, the story kind of was out of the news for a while, and she suffered physically and had to go to the hospital, based on that incident and afterwards. And so to think that this woman passed away a week ago because her chair was damaged while flying is utterly avoidable. And it's sad. And it's an example of when we don't do what we need to do when it comes to accessibility, it really can bring harm. And hers is not the only story. I think the statistic is that about 30 wheelchairs a day are damaged by airlines. And so it's really incumbent upon us to go, whoa, let's sit with that story, for one, because that's a real story. And two, what can we do to get involved?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And even as you mentioned earlier, accessibility, any of us can join that at any point in our lives, whether it's through trauma or accidents or through, you know, mental, what's the word I'm looking for? Decay over time.
Yeah.
There's so many different things. I've had personally friends who were able-bodied walking people who had an accident and are in wheelchair. So it's something we should always be thinking about. And I think it's a shame for that woman's story, but we know that it's happening and elsewhere. Just to pivot a bit, there was a question that came in, I think that fits well here, is someone wanted to know, what is a change or product or service that you did for accessibility that you're most proud of? Like what did you get to influence that you're most proud of?
Oh, that's a good question.
And you being an introvert too, I'm sure you're probably digging deep to
Yeah,
give yourself some praise here.
I am. I'll give you a twofer because one happened last night. And when things happen, you should take note of them. So, one that is not product related is I was just able to recommend someone in my network living with a disability for a position, knowing it was at another company, but knowing that she, had felt very stagnant in her own career. And because we had shared stories and I knew a little bit fuller of her story, I love connecting people. And so being in a position to use my visibility and my career journey to help other people is always important to me because it's just important that we connect with one another. So that's something, anytime that happens, I get really, really excited. I just do. But from a product perspective, I would say more recently it was building the AI for Accessibility program at Microsoft. I was part of building that program from the ground up, and it really was to look at the future of accessibility. And one of the projects that we focused around mental health, because mental health before the pandemic was the number one disability in the world. And I get that some folks don't look at it that way, but it was before the pandemic. And during the pandemic, anxiety and depression screenings shot up like 450% and 800% respectively, according to Mental Health of America. And so when you think about what we can do to elevate the conversation, I naturally think about, well, what can tech do? And so one of the projects was really looking at how to use machine learning algorithms to provide behavioral interventions right when the person needed it. And the reason why this was so impactful is because not everyone can afford to go to a mental health care worker or a therapist. And so to democratize mental health support using technology and to personalize it with data based on what the person was going through at the time was just huge. And so I got to work with Northwestern University and the University of Toronto and Mental Health America on that project. And so things like that just make me happy in the sense that we're looking forward and far out enough that we can change the trajectory now.
Great. Thanks for sharing that. And I think you're already influencing some people on this call here. I've seen a few things in the chat. One person mentioned, thanks for mentioning the tip to check accessibility. They just updated their signature in their to use the alternate text, and we'll use it going forward. And someone else just mentioned that it's, making them think that, the products in their BU, whether or not they're being accessible enough and what to do. So I think, you by doing these conversations that as an introvert, you're very good at, are already sharing, I think, some good awareness for people and making a difference. Well, great. So feel free, others, if you do have questions, to keep putting them in the chat. We'll continue to bring them in. But I think, Heather, while we're waiting, curious, you talked a bit about the things that you've seen or done with technology, but is there something that you see, as technology continues to evolve, what do you see as the biggest barrier? And how about the biggest opportunity? I know you mentioned a few things already about just web and things that the virtual world has opened up our eyes to, but do you see anything bigger than that? Like what's our biggest barrier?
Right now, I would talk and I would mention it being around employment because there is a shift that has happened as a result of the pandemic. We're all either working remotely or in some hybrid, flexible environment. And before the pandemic, the disability community asked for flexible and remote work, and in many cases was told that that just isn't possible. But yet the pandemic happened and we saw that it was quite possible, and in some cases can work really well. And so as we move to a new normal, to the post-COVID, I like to say, because there is no going back after this. It really is important that we think about how to be more inclusive in our hiring practices, so that that unemployment rate for people with disabilities, that also quite honestly went up during the pandemic, as we initially saw there were so many job losses at large for our country, but people with disabilities were at the forefront of those job losses. And so when we think about opportunities to kind of right size employment and roles and new roles, I really would like to crush that unemployment rate, because I think that there is so much that goes behind that, again, based on how our culture perceives disability, that influences us. Our own personal networks. Do you have someone with a living with a disability in your network? Have you just taken the time to really understand a little bit about their day-to-day and how they move through life? Are we mentoring youth with disabilities and training up the next generation of leaders who just happen to have a disability? Those are things that I want us to think about at large when we really think about this global inclusive recovery after the pandemic, and how things will be different, but quite honestly, how they could be so much better, especially for people living with disabilities.
Yeah, and I would, like, to your point, I would hope, naturally we're going to get that, because right now with the job market, we're doing virtual interviews, things like that. So there's a lot less chances for those maybe unimplicit, biases that people might have, towards people with disabilities. So you hope that in general there you would have an increase in employment. But I really do hope we also have an implicit recognition that, we need to dig more into this, and hopefully this new job market that seems to be crazy right now will offer opportunities there. Great insight. I don't see any other questions coming in. So I'm curious, like, going back to storylines a bit, so now your story has brought you, through Motorola, Microsoft, now Netflix, as director of accessibility at Netflix, what are you most excited on for this next phase in your career journey and your story?
Well, I'm excited to be part of a company that really is a culture maker. We don't have phrases like Netflix and chill and binge watch Netflix for nothing. And so how we can be more inclusive, even within entertainment, and bringing everyone joy. That shouldn't be limited to people without disabilities. It really should be for everyone. And especially during this pandemic, would we really want to deny someone escape and the joy that is brought through immersing yourself in other people's stories? Because it goes both ways. Not only do we, as members that currently today do not have a disability, have to expand our perspective of disability and people living with disabilities, because, by the way, there's more than 1 billion people living on this planet with disabilities, so about 15%. But also, we've got to expand the minds, even within the disability community as well, of just being able to see people living at the intersection of multiple identities, and as worthy of being able to tell their own story. And so I am excited that there's more happening in the space of inclusive storytelling, but particularly on the tech side, because that's where I'm focused currently. I cannot wait to just innovate even further. I was sharing with you, before the call, that I get to be a part of an event later on today that is looking at Netflix's history with audio descriptions, and which is an audio track that describes visually what's happening in a movie, particularly for people who are blind or have low vision. And so when we think about those types of features, just being ready to be enabled, and that you don't have to go through all of these different tricks to do it, that excites me. And it gets me thinking, like, well, what else could we do past that? What else could we lean on and learn from, given all of the advances in technology and AI, for instance, that is looking at object recognition? Like, what else could we do to really enhance that experience, as an example? And so I'm always excited to innovate. Like, that is just one of my favorite things to do in this space.
Well, great. And honestly, I hope like you get the opportunity to continue to innovate in any position you do in your future. You're an absolute pleasure to talk to, and your insights are. I hope that people on the call appreciate them as much as I do. I know I'm already thinking about the things I can do, even in social media. I think we all got to get over our maybe discomfort with it. I know I've seen some posts where people use the visual descriptors, and you think, oh, do I go do that? Are people going to think I'm silly and things? I think, definitely we need to kind of get past this as a community and really recognize that it's important. And I'm walking away here with a lot of different things on the top of my mind. So, Heather, I want to, don't want to drag this out too long, because I want to make sure people have time to get to their next meeting like we talked about earlier. But, if thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to raise your hand or put them in the chat. We are here and available. But for those of you that might have another meeting to get to or anything, we do ask that you please, fill out the survey. You'll see a QR code on the screen. I'll also put it in the chat. Your feedback is important to bring people like Heather to our sessions, that bring you value, that you learn from, that we appreciate your story. So please give us your feedback, and we would love to hear from you. But is there any other questions from anyone today? Just seeing a lot of thank you for your inspiration. Great.
The last thing I will just say is
Yeah.
that I mentioned a lot here, and most folks are like, okay, how do I get started? And it really is connection, if I can bring it back to what we focused on today. And it is sharing our story and getting to know other people's story and amplifying it where necessary and appropriate. And by expanding our network and really making sure that we diversify our network to include people with disabilities, whether that's students with disabilities or folks within your family, or just extended network, that really does help and really personify the effort that is necessary for us to truly have an inclusive society. It's a difference when I tell an engineer, like, hey, we need to do X, Y, and Z, compared to your teammate who happens to be blind, cannot access what we're doing. It makes it a lot more real. And so I hope that you've gained some tips today on exactly doing that, how to take that step in connecting with more people with disabilities in the community, and how to make accessibility real.
Well, thank you, Heather, and thank you again for joining us. I hope when you come back to Chicago that you give us a ring and we can catch up even more. But it's been an absolute pleasure catching up with you and hearing your story. So thank you. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a great rest of the day and weekend. Happy Veterans Day again to those who have served or are serving. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Take care. Bye.
Thanks, Heather.